Boeing 767-400 JFK to LAX reported 25 UAS from all surrounding directions while westbound at flight level 340. The UAS appeared to be following the aircraft for approximately 1 hour. How many drones do I know, or aircraft I know, that could pace 767 for an hour? Why is the parachute so colorful? My memory from back then is, hey, for various kinds of situations. You have a green section in case you're, someplace green. You got a white section in case you're in the snow. You got the orange to attract attention. What FAA office or officer or manager would approve something so crazy as to have research drones flying with no NOTAMs, no TFRs, in and around heavily populated areas for days on end, and not tell other parts of the FAA, not tell the media, not tell anyone? As far as the remote viewing was concerned, most of it was misses. Some of the times we had a hit, it was extraordinary. And there are folks who walk through the lab on occasion who are known in some circles now. Russell Targ, Hal Putoff, Edgar Mitchell were all folks who visited the lab at one point or another. And it was funded by the head of McDonnell Douglas was personally interested in this lab, was funding this.
Okay, you're kind of blowing my mind here, Todd. So I'm going to have to go over this again.
Chris Lehto, welcome to Lehto Files.
Okay, welcome to Lehto Files. I have a very experienced and knowledgeable guest today. It's Dr. Todd Curtis. He's a renowned aviation safety analyst. He's an author. He's best known for founding airsafe.com, a comprehensive resource dedicated to aviation safety and security information. So Dr. Curtis holds a PhD in aviation risk assessment. He has an extensive background in aviation safety, including roles at Boeing, Universal Avionics. He's authored several publications, notably Understanding Aviation Safety Data, and he's been a prominent figure in promoting aviation safety awareness. You may have seen him on his podcast, Flight Safety Detectives. I covered a recent one of his podcasts, Supersonic UAP. That was with an interesting glider pilot close encounter with multiple lollipop-looking supersonic UAPs. It's an amazing encounter. So thank you, Todd, for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me. And before we go on, a slight correction. I worked with the NTSB for almost 30 years, but I was never in the NTSB. I was a flight test engineer in the Air Force and, of course, at Boeing. And I've just worked in close collaboration, especially with my two podcast co-hosts, off and on for years.
Okay, excellent. And I noticed you have an F-16 in the background there. Is that you just like the plane, or?
Well, that is over where my finger's pointing. That is a memento from my time at the F-16 Combined Task Force at Edwards back in the mid-'80s. This was a force that was a unit that was evaluating an early infrared targeting and navigation system. Lantern was the name of it. And this was well before Desert Storm, when the time was that time in the Cold War. The most likely place that this would have been used would have been Central Europe. And here it was, I was a young lieutenant thinking, this is great in the desert air of Edwards Air Force Base, but if we ever took this to Europe, the infrared would be really horrible in all the high humidity. And of course, the first time a variation of the system was used was in the first Gulf War, with all the videos we've seen for years, and people were gobsmacked. Wow, this is great. I'm thinking, again, my young perspective on this. This is great marketing for the defense industry because they can make the argument, this will be this good wherever we use it.
Wherever.
They were lucky because they were in a very good place. The only place in the world probably where the weather conditions were better than the Mojave Desert for showcasing just how good the system is.
Yeah, I do remember the FLIR pods worked, like you said, not nearly as well in Europe. I flew out of Aviano for several years. And yeah, the humidity especially really stops the FLIR. Although you can see more with the FLIR than you can with the optical, what I found. But in the desert of Iraq, that's the perfect area, right? It's flat, it's super dry, it's perfect for air power. I think that's why, that war you saw was one of the shortest wars ever, because of that. But we were just talking before before we started recording here about a recent crash in Eielson. I don't know if most people know about this. Let me bring it up real fast. So what was your initial take just looking at this? You mentioned a few little comments before, but what's your initial comments on it?
Well, having been a former Air Force flight test engineer, of course, in the military as well, my first thought was whoever took this picture, this video, is in trouble because it looks like you're on the base and you're taking a picture of an aviation accident, which of course is great for us because we like to analyze this sort of thing. But there's always the possibility that there could be information in here that would be of quite of high interest to potential adversaries. But beyond that, the other thought was, whew, you got one shoot, this guy's going to be okay, or this woman's going to be okay. And the other thing was the gear is out on this. So
Yeah.
if the gear is out, was this aircraft configured for landing, or was there some massive hydraulic sort of failure and the gear deployed? Again, I'm not an F-35 expert on their systems, but it was intriguing to me why this aircraft was falling like a leaf straight down.
That was interesting, right? My first thought on it is I was at Eielson actually for 4 years. I flew F-16s there, and then since I left, they transitioned to F-35s. But also on that same base is a KC-135 tanker guard unit. So it looks like from the ramp over on the KC-135, looks like, someone either working on the KC-135s or maybe entering the KC-135s got this video, like you said, and shared it. So I don't think you know, the investigators probably aren't happy with that, right? They don't like when this stuff gets shared. But I think it's looking from the base outward. There's a highway actually that you see back here, Richardson Highways, right on the other side of the runway here. And I noticed kind of a similar thing, like you said, is the gear's out and it's falling like a leaf, right over the middle of the runway. And, if they were taking off or landing, you're not going to be in that position, right? You're going to be at the end of the runway. You're going to be at the end of one of the runways, although it's a very long runway, 11,000 feet, extremely long. It's actually used as an alternate for the space shuttle. They could use it as some alternate landing way up north in Fairbanks, Alaska. So that's the first thing I noticed was the gear was down. The second thing is the pilot is he's lower than the fighter. Did you notice that? So he ejected up higher and then somehow he descended down in his seat and then popped the chute and then is below the fighter. I thought that was very interesting. He's
I
below
didn't
the
know that
fighter.
until now, but now that you mention it, it's like, how can that happen?
Yeah, exactly. How did that happen? So, I'm not a F-35 pilot, but I did fly F-16s, and the big similarity between the two aircraft is it's single engine, right? Single seat, single engine. They actually don't have any D models in the F-35. It's like the A-10. There's only one single seat version. It's as best I understand it. So what I think what happened here is actually there was some sort of issue in the airplane, and what you're going to do in a single engine airplane is, well, probably two engine as well if you have landing issues, but you're going to go above the airfield to a safe altitude, 10,000 feet is what we used. And then while you're up there, you're going to configure the aircraft so that you can land, and then you're going to check the engine and make sure it works and everything works, flight controls, etc., at that lower airspeed. So basically, you go up to 10,000 feet above the runway in a safe area, and then you do a practice landing, essentially get down to your landing speed with everything configured and make sure everything works okay. So I think what actually happened is he got up to that location, we called it high key, and maybe ran the engine through its paces and it failed on him, is my guess, is that it failed. And so he punched out in that situation and the plane just fell and landed on the base, which is the best place for this thing to land out near the runway, but not on the runway. You don't want to damage the runway, obviously. So I think the pilot probably did everything. He did everything correctly. He's going to land safely. And then the airplane's obviously lost. But so I think he did everything correctly.
If you can put that still photo back up, I wanted to point out something.
Okay.
You made me flash back to 40 plus years ago when I was in the Air Force and had some exposure to being around airplanes because flying support missions, I had to know a little bit very little about emergency escapes and all that sort of thing. Why is a parachute so colorful? My memory from back then is, hey, for various kinds of situations, you have a green section in case you're, in some place green. You got a white section in case you're in the snow. You got the orange to attract attention. And so there was a very practical reason for that. Of course, you have a knife that you can rip open the shroud lines or rip open the parachute itself and use that as a shelter or to notify people circling above that, hey, I'm down here. Look at the orange thing. So is my memory from 40 plus years ago more or less correct, or am I fantasizing here?
I think you're spot on. Yeah, the parachute's a great signaling device. We definitely use the parachute as an asset if in your survival training. You're going to use it,
I was I was in the military so long ago that there are some of the older pilots who still had the orange flight suits from when they were assigned to basically protecting the North American homeland. So it's like, why do you have the orange flight suit? So they can see us.
Okay, so this was one of 3 crashes actually in the last week, which is pretty unbelievable. What is your initial take on the DCA crash?
My initial thought when I heard the news reports was I was flashing back to 1982, which was the Air Florida event, which is the last time there was a fatal passenger event at DCA. And it
Huh.
was about the same time of year. It was mid January back then, and it was late January here. And I'm thinking, if they don't get those folks out of the water, if there are any survivors, hypothermia is going to take over big time. And as more information came in, one of the things I thought about was here is a mid-air collision with an airliner. When's the last time that happened? Well, fortunately for me, when I put my website together back in 96, one of the pages I put together was every mid-air collision, especially in the US, involved an airliner. And there were, I think, 6 of them between 1960 and 1986. And of all those mid-airs, only one person survived. That was, I think, the backseater of an F4 that ran into a DC-9. And there was nothing for 38 years. So like 7 and 26 years, 0 for 38 years, then DCA. And from the perspective of, well, is flying safe? On the one hand, you can make the risk argument, well, the risk of having a mid-air collision is so low, we had 0 in 38 years. On the other hand, you can make the safety argument, which is the argument that is the gut feeling most people have. 1 in 38 years is too many. This is that one. This is too many. And because of the extremely high media and public and political attention paid to this will be a particularly interesting one to diagnose.
Yeah, I've made 2 videos on it. I think the biggest concern I have that I think is the issue is that it was at night and they're doing this visual maneuver. The RJs basically they're cleared on the 0-1 approach, and then they do a change to 3-3. So they basically it's what is that, a 30-degree off runway. So they have to do a right turn, and then they have a descending turn over the water, coming back to land on 3-3. And I think at night, if you consider a visual maneuver like that, it's going to be almost impossible maybe for them to see any, like the helicopter in that situation, as well as the helicopter now is doing night vision training. All of our MVG training, all of it basically is on optical illusions. That you have your soda straw, you're looking in the IR realm. I'm sure if you've done any safety investigation on MVGs or any sort of night accidents, usually a causal factor is optical illusions from night vision goggles. Is that been your experience as well?
Well, I'd never done a military investigation that had that. None of the
Mhm.
civilian ones I've been involved with had that, but certainly reading reports over the years, that's a concern. And another concern is going to be the procedures in the military cockpit. Did you have 0, 1, or 2 pilots with NVGs on at that time? And this is something that was pointed out to me by a colleague yesterday. I'm of the mentality that, like in civil aviation, you have the pilot flying, the pilot not flying. The pilot not flying is the one doing the communications with air traffic control. But in the military, tell me if I'm wrong, this may not be the case. You can have a two crew helicopter where one person happens to be flying and communicating at the same time, and this is a normal thing.
I don't know. I only flew single seats. So we didn't have that issue. We had the issue with task saturation. Um, Either
And
way,
on
I
that
think,
note,
yeah, I think they didn't. I believe that they called visual with the wrong aircraft. There was an aircraft behind the one that they impacted. And if you're on a collision course with something, you're not going to have any line of sight, right? It's going to just come straight towards you, and you're going to see a little dot till the very end, and then it's going to get big. So I really think without any sort of depth perception at night, all the lights are going to look almost the same distance. It's really flat. But we consider it just another sensor. The MVGs is just another sensor. You can't use it at all for your depth perception. You have to have line of sight, and you have to coordinate it with another distance measuring sensor. Essentially, that's why we always use connecting DME between the aircraft. The distance to the fighter that you're flying off of. There's countless stories. It happened all the time. Usually not with experienced pilots, but even with experienced pilots, it happens. They just catch it faster. Is they'll fly formation off a commercial airliner that's 30 miles away, right? There'll be a wingman. He's supposed to be flying formation off of me, but you'll notice him flying off. We'll see in the debrief, what happened? Where did he go? And he's just flying off here, and you're like, I know you're flying off a commercial airliner, weren't you? And he's like, yes, sir. It does happen, and sometimes it happens for quite a long time. The more experience you get, you still make that mistake, but then you catch it after 10 seconds. You're like, wait a minute, that what am I flying off of? Just because you've done it in the past. I think that's where the experience comes from. So I think they just maybe didn't have that level of experience. So I don't know. We'll see what comes out of it. Yeah, it's
and a
unfortunate.
couple of things I'm looking for in this investigation from the NTSB is something where they depict what were the pilots seeing or could see if they looked out of their cockpits. And for this particular accident, there were a line of aircraft stretching for miles coming into runway 01. And was the helicopter in a position where there would have been sort of like a conjunction of several lights at once? And if you key off one of those lights thinking that's the one you're supposed to fly behind, and it happens to be the one 6 nautical miles behind, then we can imagine what can happen there. The other thing for people who have ever been to DC and walked around near the Washington Monument and the Capitol and such, you might have noticed that, wow, these airplanes are awfully close. And yes, they are awfully close. Uh, Reagan National Airport is, I don't know, a mile or so from the Capitol building. And across the river, you have the Pentagon. So you have a lot of unique traffic situations there where you have a busy airport. You have unscheduled helicopter flights of all types from the White House, from the Pentagon, from what have you. You have helicopter routes which are very close to the active airport. And on a normal, beautiful, clear day, you could look around thinking, wow, this is a busy airspace. How do they keep everything apart?
Yeah, I think that's why they use visual procedures. But what we're going to find is if you use visual procedures at night, then you have to deal squarely with optical illusions. And I think if one of those aircrew is on night vision goggles, it's going to create just, a nightmare scenario, which is what we saw here. Um, so you mentioned there's
I,
been no accidents or no, I'm sorry, no mid-airs. But I do remember I had a friend, his name was never released to the public, but he was in an F-16 and actually had a mid-air with a Cessna. He was,
well, let me be
uh,
specific. A midair
uh,
with an airliner that led to fatalities. Well, there have
okay,
been
yeah,
many.
an airliner. Yep. Yeah, this was, I think, a similar situation. Um, the Cessna was flying visual flight rolls. He was on instrument rolls actually. And I think when you're on a collision path with something, you're not gonna see any line of sight, especially your peripheral vision. You imagine, if you're not looking right there, you're not gonna see anything that's not moving with the background. If it's just staying consistently on this collision path, your peripheral vision, you're not gonna see it. And so I think that's where his jet just cut right through the Cessna, actually. Um, yeah, no damage really, or no significant damage at all to the F-16, and obviously the Cessna was was done. So, and for two fatalities on that one, that was terrible.
You
Okay.
just made me
Yeah.
flash back to 44 years ago. No, 41 years ago. I was flying privately when I was in the Air Force through the Aero Club, and I was in a 172 near the base. And I remember making a turn and looking out the window and seeing, I recognized this as a P3 Orion coming straight at me. My first thought was, why is that P3 coming at me? My second thought was, make a right turn. Of course, I was the one at fault for being in the wrong place at the right time, but the thoughts that run through my mind, fortunately, I aviated rather, and navigated, and didn't try to debate with the P3, please get out of my way or anything silly like that.
The P3. Yeah, we mentioned we were chatting before, as you mentioned a P3 here. It's not a P3, it was an AWACS actually. And we mentioned Eielson there, but I do remember, and you brought it up, was the AWACS crash where you had the birds actually, Canadian geese, you said, went down the
That's correct.
intake of that aircraft. That was a terrible crash, I remember. So what was your experience with that one?
Well, at the time, I was a flight test engine, not a flight test engineer, but a safety engineer at Boeing. And one of the things I did was analyze all sorts of safety data. I had been tasked sometime before, a year or so before, with looking at engine events involving birds. And I looked for patterns of what was happening here and why. And I got into it to the point that I was in contact with the Bird Strike Committee USA, Bird Strike Committee Canada, did a couple of presentations on bird strikes and large aircraft. So when this happened to the AWACS, of course, it was a military aircraft, but produced by Boeing. Someone at the Wichita office found out that I was a bird strike guy, and they asked me to go up there to help investigate. And so I gave what in the field expertise I could to what was going on. And this was a situation where at takeoff, the most critical phase of flight, you had roughly, I think it was roughly 2 dozen birds hit the aircraft, including several, one or more, being ingested into both engines, I believe, on the right side of the aircraft, engine 3 and 4. And at that phase of flight, as many of you know, from civil aviation, airliners are designed so the most critical engine could lose power at the most critical phase of flight, still be able to take off. This was more than one engine's worth of power that was taken away at takeoff. And of course, the AWACS has the big struts in the back to support the radome, which changes the aerodynamics on the empennage of that aircraft. So they were in a much more precarious position with any sort of power loss at takeoff. And unfortunately, in this case, they weren't able to make it around and make it back to the field.
I do remember. And my friend, when I was at Eielson, 2009, I believe, he was flying an incentive rider. So basically a maintenance guy who got a free ride in an F-16 in the back seat, and he hit a Canadian geese, went down the intake with a large, again, that's a large bird and single engine aircraft. And he actually didn't have time because he knew the engine was terrible. So he's not going to do what that F-35 pilot did and go to high key, right? He knows what there's something catastrophic going on. He's not going to try and test it. He's going to fly right to land to low key actually, and try and land. But yeah, I'll never forget because I listened to his tapes. Actually, watched his tapes, and he says just he's a cool customer. He just says to his backseater, just sit back and relax. One way or another, we'll be on the ground in 30 seconds. And so luckily they didn't have to eject. They came back and landed, no issues. The GE engine's amazing. But yeah, if we
And
haven't, yes, go ahead.
yeah, the follow-up to that is I wrote the book, as you mentioned, Understanding Aviation Safety Data, came out about 4 years after that accident. And that accident turned out to be a piece of one of the chapters because the question was, how do you analyze a whole series of events and trying to find patterns between them? So I went and looked at every bird strike accident with a large airliner type aircraft where we had enough information about it and tried to find some patterns. It wasn't a pattern of damage as much as the outcome of what happened. In about 3 or 4 of the cases, the aircraft was lost. But also in 3 or 4 of the cases, there was a change of command. The pilot flying went from the co-pilot or the first officer to the pilot or the captain. In a couple of those cases, there was an explicit change of command. That is, my aircraft, your aircraft type of exchange that was recorded. But in a couple of cases, it was a silent exchange. So that brought up the whole issue of of human performance and human behavior in the cockpit in a situation like this? Is it better to have a more formalized, verbalized, obvious change of command in a situation like that versus something that isn't? In my opinion, it's best to take a lesson from that and make it formalized if you have to change who's the pilot flying in the middle of an emergency.
And that was Sully as well. I interviewed Peter DiNucci on this podcast, and he was really big into aviation safety and was there actually when they dropped the numbers because it used to be much worse. So back in the 80s, he was saying they were crashing planes effectively left and right. And then you mentioned there has been a midair, but like you said, there hasn't been a midair for 38 years. You know, that's really miraculous if you think about it. So I don't know. I really think it's very safe. Although I don't know, we probably scared many of the audience members here so far. I do think it's safe, but let's go just because I have you here. Let's look at the third accident that happened last week. Check that one out. Okay, so this is the third one in Philadelphia, another just tragic accident, right? So this one, you basically have a medevac a medical flight, Learjet. So really very durable jet, you know, you're not expecting any sort of major issues with it. There was some clouds, but I looked for any sort of icing. You do have light rain and fog, but the temperature was 49 degrees. So I initially thought there'd be some sort of icing because as soon as they take off here, they make a call to departure, a normal call. I'm sorry, they're cleared to go to departure. And then departure's waiting for them to check in. They never check in. And then what you get is this jet effectively makes a left turn and ends up impacting high angle into a neighborhood in Philadelphia. Really a terrible accident. You know, what's your initial thoughts on this one?
Well, when I first saw this, is of course from the videos that were on Twitter, and what struck me was that it sounded from one of the videos as though the engines were developing power and not idle power either, but takeoff power or close to it. And I thought to myself, why would this happen? Having the aircraft coming out of the clouds, my first thought was, is there something to do with spatial disorientation and somehow they ended up thinking they were level or turning in one direction. In fact, they weren't. And you can probably go into this in great detail. In a normal situation, if you have no outside visual cues, you can get disoriented any number of ways. For example, the airplane's turning, you turn your head to pick up a pen from the floor or whatever. You turn back, you're all squirrely in the head and you don't know which way is up. And this was very, very short flight, roughly a minute or so,
Yeah.
less than a minute between takeoff and the maximum altitude that they were at. They were supposed to take a heading, I think, to 290, like a 50-degree turn to the right. Instead, for whatever reason, they were going to the left. So I'm thinking stall, loss of control, something happening in the cockpit that was unexpected, possibly even a medical situation with the pilot. The combination of very short flight and a high angle impact into the ground. This has happened before, at least once I can think of, with a medical flight. It was a PC-12 a few years ago where it took off in limited visibility conditions, crashed shortly after takeoff. And I'm going to have to review that accident report. It was stateside, so it was an NTSB report. I'll have to review that to see if there are any sequences of events that might be similar to what's going on here.
Yeah, you mentioned spatial disorientation. I actually was the pilot member on a Iraqi general. He was a F-16 pilot. They were training him to actually be an F-16 pilot. He wasn't an F-16 pilot. He had 2,000 hours in other aircraft, right? Older aircraft. And it happened just super fast. I think he was at 24,000 feet, spatial disoriented. Again, night vision goggles were involved. And 30 seconds later, he impacted the ground. That's from, you know, almost so 4 miles up, 30 seconds. Wow. 30 seconds he impacted the ground. So it can happen extremely fast. Yeah, you wonder if spatial disorientation. You heard that the engines were actually at full thrust when it impacted?
One of the videos I heard engine noises, and my thought was, okay, if
Hmm.
nothing else, the NTSB will be able to take that, get the sound spectra out of it, and get some semblance of an idea if this was a normal sound or not a normal sound for this engine at that phase of flight.
Yeah, interesting. The other ways you can do that is obviously the black box will tell you everything you need to know, and I believe they recovered it. You can also look at the turbine blades, so you can see how they're bent. If the actual speed, you can get the RPM of the engine at the time, how fast it was actually spinning. So there's several ways to get that, but that's quite interesting. I don't know what to make of this one. I think yeah, it'll be some weird either flight controls malfunction or spatial disorientation possibly, but yeah, anyway, we'll have to see. So that's interesting. But let's move on now to I think what most of the audience is here to see is actually before, if we're done scaring them, is with some interesting UAP topics. And you already mentioned some blockbuster ones just before we even started recording. So can you talk about the UAS that you found, the UAS encounter that followed a
Well,
767 for an hour?
I'll talk about the most recent event, which is intriguing, to put it mildly. There is a database called the FAA database, UAS Sightings Report Database. Typically, UAS is the FAA's term for drones. Let me see if I got this right. Unmanned aircraft systems. And typically, the report is I'm flying into an airport and this drone was 500 feet off my right wing type of thing. I was reviewing this on a regular basis because of me following this for years. But recently, because of the drone events in New York and New Jersey, I was particularly interested in the last quarter's worth of data. They released them 3-month blocks, the October through December block from 2024. I looked at November and December for anything in New York and New Jersey that was completely extraordinary. And although there were about 44 events in New York and New Jersey, none of them was even close to some of the more extraordinary reports I heard on the media or from social media. We had SUV size UAS, that type of thing. Didn't see anything like that.
Not one.
But in between New York and New Jersey, alphabetically, is New Mexico. There was exactly one report from New Mexico, and I casually read it, and it's like my eyes popped out. This was a 767-400 flying from JFK to LAX, about 80 miles or so northeast of, I think, Santa Fe, somewhere around there, about 100 miles northeast of Santa Fe. And I'll have to read the actual um, entry here because it still makes me shake my head. ARTCC, the Air Route Traffic Control Center, advised Boeing 767-400 JFK to LAX reported 25 UAS from all surrounding directions while westbound at flight level 340, 50 miles east-northeast of Fort Union Vortex. The UAS appeared to be following the aircraft for approximately 1 hour. No evasive action taken, no radar primaries detected by facilities or partners, no law enforcement organization notification reported due to broad area of event occurrence. Okay, a lot to unpack there.
Wow.
First, let's look at the date, December 21st. This was the Saturday night before Christmas. So one of the thoughts I had is, they're flying over New Mexico, they're near White Sands, Holloman Air Force Base. Maybe there's some special flight test, something going on. But I'm thinking, back in my days of doing flight test support at Edwards, one of the things that struck me is like, wait a minute, we're a military organization, but we don't do stuff on the weekends. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of civilians who support this activity and they don't work on the weekends. This is the Saturday before Christmas. How easy would it be to get an organization together to fly 25 anything on a Saturday night for no apparent reason? That's one thing. Second thing, flight level 340. To
That's a big
paraphrase
thing.
that's a big thing. There are drones that fly at flight level 340. There are not that many of them. They're special purpose drones, and the Global Hawk being one of them. I don't think there is a case, an instance where 25 Global Hawks have ever been in the air at once, or 25 other UAS's drones that have that capability being in the area at once for anything special. Possibly it happened during war. I wouldn't know that. I'm not in that business anymore. But this was highly unusual over New Mexico at that time of night. Now, let's go to the other thing that made me scratch my head. It followed them for an hour. It didn't specifically say if all 25 followed them, but even if only one of them followed them. I looked at the flight track of the very likely aircraft there. By the way, it was a Delta Airlines 767-400, flight number DL771, which was the flight track that made the most sense given that report. So yes, if you want to go do a FOIA report on stuff about that, please do so, and I'll talk about FOIA later. I thought, how many drones do I know, or aircraft I know, that could pace 767 for an hour? Of course, there are a lot of crewed aircraft that can do that. But the report was these were UAS. How the pilots thought they were UAS and not traditional aircraft, I don't know. I hope to find that out through the FOIA report. But I don't know of any drone that could pace an airliner for an hour and do so reliably.
Even a Global Hawk, I don't think they can fly that fast, just based
Now,
on how far their giant wingspan and how high they actually fly. So it wouldn't be a Global Hawk. A Predator definitely can't fly that fast. I think their surface ceiling is like 25,000 on a Predator. They can't even get that high. So I don't know. And then when you say pace them, 2025, this is just an amazing encounter. How did they count 25 of these things? Is it off the side of the window? Because they can't see backwards in those aircraft, from what I understand. I don't think they have cameras.
to my knowledge, they don't. And the aircraft was flying straight toward LA the whole time. They didn't do a turn to the left or the right. So perhaps they overstated things saying from all surrounding directions. However, if I saw 25 of anything flying at my altitude at flight level 340, I might be a little excited and overstate things. But this definitely fits my civil aviation definition of UAS. Even if these were conventional aircraft, they were in a very unexpected location. It may have a conventional explanation. I'd like to see that. If this were done with the approval of the government, and I'm referring here to the press conference at the White House on the 28th of January, the day before the DC crash,
Research
where
drones.
the research drones. So yes, the president's been briefed. These were research drones approved by the FAA. And I thought, this is a family show. This is not credible. What FAA office or officer or manager would approve something so crazy as to have research drones flying with no NOTAMs, no TFRs, in and around heavily populated areas for days on end, and not tell other parts of the FAA, not tell the media, not tell anyone? And the other non-credible part of this is the New Jersey, New York drone reports were heavily happening in November and December during the previous administration. If this were approved by the previous administration, this would be the height of irresponsibility. This would be an easy opportunity for the current administration to say the last administration had its head in a very dark place. Yet that opportunity wasn't taken.
Hmm. You're right, because normally they point out every little mistake that the Biden administration did. And now they're just saying, no, we know what it is. It was research drones, which is just unbelievable. I remember seeing the sheriff when he just is so frustrated, speaking about how they watched one of his deputies watched 50 drones come over the ocean, and they know the flight profiles for the aircraft in that area. To think that that's just research drones, and that was after several days. It had been out on the news for several days. If really was 50 research drones going on over a civilian area, how could they not have explained it? It's unbelievable to me. I really hope that the mainstream media or journalists that are actually allowed in there will not just crumble, and will not just be snowballed by this, and will actually ask some follow-up questions.
Now, a couple of things about this, and this is important for those who want to get to the bottom of stuff like this. I know from previous experience that after 45 days, audio tapes from the FAA are typically not going to be preserved. This event happened December 21st. The report from the previous quarter was released on January 21st. I didn't get around to reading this around until around January 29th. I probably would have done so a few days earlier, but there were things happening a few days earlier. And I looked at my calendar and I thought, oh my gosh, Friday is like day 41. I'd better get a FOIA request out right now and put something in there to get a chance of getting some decent data. Over the weekend, I talked to a colleague, and the colleague gave me some insights as to what specific resources, both organizational and technological. There is a process within the FAA and other parts of government called the Domestic Event Network, which is a coordinating sort of issue. If there's something that's happening with the FAA, they want to get involved other parts of government to figure out if there is something going on. There's that. So I asked for any written reports related to the domestic event network. There's also something called the Falcon Radar Replay System, which is something the FAA has where it can replay the events from a particular flight, including the radar data and any communications. So my FOIA request, my second FOIA request specifically asked for information from these two sources. And I gave a specific flight because if I just said, hey, anything flying that was a 767-400, give me something. But if I give them something very specific, and again, it was a process of elimination. I went to my favorite place, Flight Radar 24. No, they're not paying me for this promotional insert. But I looked on December 21st for anything that was flying from New York to LA and what was available. There was one track that flew right over the location that was listed in the report. I looked at the day before, the day after, no track was close. I looked at that flight number that day, the day before, the day after. They weren't close the day before, the day after. So December 21st, that specific flight, I have high confidence that that was the one that had that. Now, if anyone out there is from Delta Airlines, or if you're the crew who were there that night, I would highly recommend that you send in a report to NASA's Aviation Safety Reporting System. Why? First, I'm going to gather my information and send a report there. The Aviation Safety Reporting System, if they get multiple reports on the same event, they typically put them into one entry in their database. So you would have plausible deniability that you weren't the one who wrote this up.
And that's anonymous, right? The NASA's Aviation Safety Database. Yeah.
They have been in existence since the mid-1970s. And according to NASA, they're quite proud of this. They've had over 2 million reports in that time. Not once has the identity of a reporting person been revealed by NASA.
Okay. Nice. So they should, feel comfortable going to that website and posting that information.
And because the ASRS does not have any coded variables for UAP, explicitly put words in there that talk about what you experienced, what you saw. And also, and I highly recommend this segues into the other UAP story, talk about what effect it had on you personally, either when it came to decision making or whether it led to other issues later on, whether it freaked you out. This is anonymous. There are issues with pilot mental health, which have come up in at least one UAP report. I know this because this is the one I did the show about. And this is an effect that I really didn't consider until recently. Yes, I thought about, well, what if a UAP runs into another airplane? Well, I'll tell you this. I looked at tens of thousands of accident and incident reports over the last few decades. Not once did I ever see one that was suspicious to me of being a UFO/UAP hitting an aircraft. I'll also say this. Having been on the inside, actually participating in accident investigations and this sort of thing, if I were at Boeing and something came across the wires where somebody said, a UFO hit my wing, there's no way in heck we would have put UFO in the report. We might have talked about there was an unknown aircraft hit the wing. We might have talked specifically about the damage caused by that. But the UFO part of it would have been scrubbed. So things might have happened in the past, but people had a legitimate incentive not to say anything about it.
You mentioned leads into the next UAP story. So what is that one?
In 2015, there was a glider pilot south of Albany who, along with his passenger, had a close encounter with a UAP. And shortly after this, in fact, within days of this pilot got in touch with NARCAP, which is an independent research organization led at the time by Richard Haynes, who's a former NASA scientist, where they had a very detailed analysis of the report. They had drawings of the flight path, estimated flight path of the UAP. They had drawings made both by the pilot and his backseat passenger of whatever it was that was flying next to them. And let me just say that it wasn't the least bit aerodynamic. I've never seen a drone or other aircraft that had that kind of configuration. And also,
Lollipop configuration, or a flying umbrella or something like that.
with an antenna and something chunky hanging on the umbrella handle hanging down. And according to the witness, he had a reference point, Wyndham High Peak Mountain in upstate New York, and it traversed a distance between the mountain and himself that you estimated in your analysis was Mach 1.8. Within 15, 20 seconds, this same device, whatever it was, went from being off his right wingtip, crossing in front of the airplane, to forming up off his left wingtip. And their sailplane was flying around, what, 60 knots. So let me ask you this. You've been a military pilot, probably been exposed to a few things I've never seen before. Do you know of any aerospace vehicle that can go in the atmosphere from Mach 1.8 to 60 knots within 15 seconds?
No, not at all. I mean, there's no way. Just to slow down, yeah. No, it took us 20 miles. That's the fastest I've ever been, actually. It was Mach 1.83. And that was in Alaska when I was flying up there, Eielson. The jet was kind of like shaking a little, and I could feel the nose was a little wobbly. But no, it took me, I think, 60 miles to get up to that speed, 70 miles, something like that. And then to
How
slow
long would it take
down,
you to get down to stall speed of the F-16, which is above 60 knots? How long would it take you to go from Mach 1.8 to stall speed?
3 minutes, four
So 15
minutes
seconds
maximum.
was a bit
Yeah. Yeah.
was a bit beyond your
Probably
capability.
no more than, yeah, at least 3 or 4 minutes. Yeah, I think it'd take you a long time. Definitely nothing can do that 15 seconds that I know of. It's impossible.
So this is fortunate on many levels. One, he immediately took stock of the situation. When he landed, the girlfriend of the backseater, the backseater was on his first ride in a sailplane. The girlfriend said, "Go in separate rooms and write this down." They did. His community of pilots around there, he had several of them who were involved in various levels of drone technology, had them look up, hey, is there anything like this you've ever seen? They couldn't. He had a recommendation from someone to contact ASRS. So at some point after this, he wrote a report there and he got in contact with NARCAP and they did a detailed report on it. Now, it turns out I was actually on the email chain involved with this because at the time I'd been in contact with Richard Haynes. I'd actually interviewed him like 2 years before. And he asked me a couple of questions about what I think happened. I didn't give any useful information, but it turns out, looking in my email chain, the pilot's email was in there. So he was CC'd on a lot of these. I never talked to him directly back then. Never even wanted to because that was Richard's job. And 9 years later, I come across this NARCAP report and I thought, well, gee, I wonder if I can find out something about what happened here and why. And the report said that it went to a particular airport in New York. So I looked at the airport, had a glider organization there, called the head of the glider organization, and that's how I found this particular pilot. Now, what he didn't say in either his ASRS report or the NARCAP report was what personally happened to him. He was saying essentially, in flight, he was freaked out to the point of the hair standing on the back of his neck. And that he was, by the way, did an extraordinary job. He aviated, he navigated, and he waited till he got on the ground to communicate. He had this in the right sequence. He had a phone in his pocket, didn't even think of taking it out because, again, he had to aviate and navigate. And some wiseacres out there, well, they should have taken out the phone and taken a picture. It's unbelievable that the backseater wouldn't have had something in his pocket. Look, if I'm flying a small aircraft, I'm taking up somebody for the first time, I might say something on the order of, take all the pictures you want before or after, but when we're in the aircraft, keep the phone in your pocket. I don't want to have you dropping your phone when
Mm.
I'm flying around and this thing
Yeah.
rattling around somewhere in the flight controls. So
Super dangerous. Yeah, if you drop anything in an F-16, the plane is impounded essentially, unless you find it. Even a pencil eraser. Yeah.
he, for the first time in this interview, and I just let him talk because it's like I'm like amazed listening to him, describing how he felt in flight, describing how he had a bit of a flashback the next time he flew like a week or so later that he sort of quashed and kept flying the sailplane. And the fact that he had nightmares for 6 months.
Hmm.
And I had a couple of thoughts after the show. It's like, this is a person who had about 300 hours total, a couple hundred in gliders, 100 in Cessnas. If this were a brand new pilot, student pilot, 20 hours, first or second time solo, and this happened to them, what's the likelihood they would have lost composure and lost control of the aircraft? Even if whatever this thing was didn't touch it, you would have had a loss of an aircraft and absolutely no evidence of this being caused by UAP.
Hmm.
So from the aviation safety side, yes, one of the potential issues I did not consider until doing this interview is the short-term and long-term effects that could lead to a loss of control or the person walking away from aviation.
Hmm.
You know, you do anything, new career, whatever, and something happens where you have nightmares for 6 months. How enthusiastic are you going to be to keep going in that career?
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of my most popular videos over the last several months. And you said by far the most popular video on your channel out of 250
The
videos.
the flight safety detectives have done 250, I think 254 videos. This is number one in YouTube views and engagements and comments. Some of the comments were very insightful. Some of the comments were, let's just say, less than insightful.
Yeah.
But that's going to very likely end up in the update of my Understanding Aviation Safety book, which I'm in the initial stages of doing. And the same publisher, when I told them about what I've been doing with UAP and aviation safety, they were interested in a book about that as well. So one of the long-term things I'm looking at is UAP, of course, is all in the news. Disclosure is all in the news. Even if tomorrow afternoon the government, major defense contractors come clean as to the history of this will still be an aviation safety issue because not all UAP are technology. Not all UAP that may be revealed in any kind of disclosure would cover all the bases. There will still be events coming on. And even if it is a known unknown UAP, potential effects are still going to be something to look at because I'm absolutely certain you have 100% disclosure tomorrow. It will take months or years before that news filters out to all levels of aviation. And it's known commonly to all pilots, just like thunderstorms are known to all pilots. And there will also be, for the time being, a real reticence, you know, or resistance, or whatever you want to call it, to talking about this openly, even to reporting something that happened to you personally.
Have you
And
noticed
that's
that the
just in the United
stigma,
States. Forget about the rest of the country, the rest of the world.
have you noticed the stigma is still a major issue, even after all the news and reporting we've seen?
Oh, absolutely. And not just because that people may not believe in UAPs/UFOs. Even if everyone in the organization believes in it and believes that what may have happened to you or someone else is legitimate, there's a certain protection of what's it, losing face. Do you really want the president of a major airline saying, "Oh yes, our pilots are seeing these all the time"? And if every other president of major airline said, "No, our pilots aren't seeing this," do you
No.
really want to be out front and center getting all the negative press because you happen to be honest about a risk that's going on? This isn't just UAP. I saw this happen in my career when it came to reporting of events that were not required to be reported that ended up, let's say, in an FAA database. Some reporter or some pundit would say, well, look, this airline has 25 of these. None of the other airlines have ever reported this. And the airline that reported it was doing the right thing for
Yep.
aviation safety, but the wrong thing for public perception.
Yeah, I noticed that before. If you have zero safety incidents, it's probably because you have no reporting. It's probably you're in a more dangerous situation. Actually, you're always going to have some safety incidents, at least some sort of reports. 99.9% of the time, it's not going to be some tragic accident like we just talked about. Again, one midair in 38 years. I think it's just a miraculous number. But if you have no reporting, then there's an obvious issue. And especially with all the drones, I find it pretty suspicious that you didn't find any reports of UASs after all of the reports we literally saw on TV.
Well, let me be
Huh.
specific. I saw 44 reports from New York and New Jersey for November and December in that database, but none of
Oh.
those 44 really stood out as being that much different from the typical report in that database, which
Hmm.
is fairly low altitude, traditional looking drone, small, slow, etc.
I see. So you limited, this was the only one above 10,000 feet you said that looked actually interesting.
Well, there were a couple reported above 10,000 feet for New York and New Jersey, but they weren't remarkable. It's like,
Hmm.
they saw something out in the distance, or they said they were at an altitude and they said they saw the UAS, but it wasn't clear if the UAS was at or above their altitude. And there was nothing about the performance in that report that really made it stand out. So I put those aside. I was looking for something that was really, off the wall. If they were flying on its wingtip, or if they saw the size and could estimate it to be much, much, much larger than a traditional drone, that would have been noteworthy. Or if any of the New York or New Jersey ones said, I saw 10 of these at this altitude, whatever, I would
Yeah.
have flagged that as well, because that means it's fitting some of the reports we've seen of whole groups of drones being seen in places they shouldn't.
Do you think you'll get any more information on the 25 UAS up at, flight level 340?
I will either get something or I will get nothing.
Hmm.
If I get anything from the FAA about it, even if it's just routine, that's a good thing. If they
Hmm.
say, oh, by the way, we don't have those tapes anymore, and I put in the FOIA request before the 45-day limit, I will be suspect. By the way, getting back to the glider event,
Hmm.
he did contact an FAA official who basically blew him off, sort of laughed at him, and said, you should just tell this story to your friends type of thing,
I remember
which
that.
is uh, which is not the proper response in this situation. But again, this was 2015.
Hmm.
This is before this kind of issue became extremely prominent in the media. And in the same era of social media that we have now. So if there had been something visual that had been recorded then and been put out, maybe there would have been uh, more feedback from the FAA. In this case, the one in December, this is something in an official FAA database. It's open to anybody in the world. Anybody can download this and look at it. FOIA is open to anybody, I think anybody in the world, not just the United States. You can put in a FOIA request right now. And if you do it to the Washington, D.C. FOIA contact for the FAA, they'll automatically send it out to all the various regional offices. So if you have something that covered an hour's worth of flight time in a 767, which does the covered Albuquerque Center, Kansas City Center, and possibly LA Center, where I can make that request. They will go to all those centers saying, look, this event happened in your jurisdiction. Here's your FOIA request. Answer it.
Okay, we were talking previously as well about interesting past that you had many years ago. Can you relay the story that you briefed about your
Why, yes, I
run-in?
can.
Yeah.
And this is something that, you know, I don't talk about much because it wasn't directly related to aviation, but it is directly related to things that, you know, you don't usually think of in engineering. I was an undergraduate at Princeton and electrical engineering department. I was looking for a research project for my junior year research project. And I read in the local campus magazine for the engineering quadrangle that, hey, the dean of the engineering school had a lab that was doing research in psychokinesis and remote perception. I thought, this sounds crazy. Let me knock on their door, see what they got going on. And I met the dean. Again, I'm just a lowly undergraduate. Never seen the dean up close and personal. He's sitting down there talking with me. I met the lab manager. They said, yeah, we got space for you here. And I thought, look, I'm more of a math guy, so I'll do statistical analyses of these sorts of things. They had experiments dealing with trying to affect an electronic device, basically an electronic coin flipper would flip thousands of times a minute. And I eventually, by the time I graduated, put together a fairly simple statistical analysis piece of software to analyze the likelihood that this was due to chance. is the kind of package you would get in R or whatnot, or you can put together with Python. But back then, we're talking 1979. We're talking Apple II computers. I had to go from scratch and use C++ to build this. I wasn't that great of a programmer. I was definitely not that great of a statistician because I was literally taking my first class trying to do work down there. But it was a learning experience. And there are folks who walk through the lab on occasion who are known in some circles now. Russell Targ, Hal Puthoff, Edgar Mitchell were all folks who visited the lab at one point or another. Mitchell, of course, I heard he was Apollo 14, walked on the moon. I was sort of like, starstruck with him in the office. I was even too afraid to say hello to him. And Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, I found out later, were involved in all sorts of interesting things at Stanford Research Lab, various kinds of government research. And even today, in all the stuff talking about UAP and whatnot, Hal Puthoff and Targ's name pops up on occasion. And it was funded by the head of McDonnell Douglas was personally interested in this lab, was funding this. To what extent, I don't know, because they didn't let me see the accounting for the lab. But it was a well-funded lab. The administration might not have liked the fact that this was happening on campus, but in the academic world, money has a way of changing minds, especially academic minds. I'm not going to go into any more detail beyond that. And I eventually did work for McDonnell Douglas shortly before joining the Air Force. And let's just say there was some interesting research being done. I'm not sure with the support of McDonnell Douglas, but definitely inside of McDonnell Douglas. I was working in the Missiles and Space Division, and one of these cipher lock, secure kind of facilities. I only had a confidential clearance, so I didn't do that much secret stuff on the job. But off the job, my boss was doing, among other things, running spoon bending parties, which I thought, okay, what I did back at Princeton was crazy. This is definitely crazy, but hey, I got nothing to do on Saturday night. Let's check it out. Not the
Okay.
first time I went, but the second time I went to one of these, one of the people attending was Michael Crichton of Andromeda Strain fame and Jurassic Park and everything else. And it's like, oh, that's Michael Crichton. It's like, all right. So I'm over there bending spoons and whatnot. I thought, look, this is Southern California. Maybe this is a normal thing. I don't know.
So what's your final take on, spoon bending and the remote viewing are able to affect the random number generator?
Well, let's start with the last one first. One of the people at McDonnell Douglas was a material scientist, and he actually did some analyses of some of the metal samples they were bending. And the one phrase that still pops in my head, he was saying that some of the metal exhibited signs of annealing at room temperature. And annealing is a process apparently happens at high temperatures with metal, but this stuff was happening at room temperature. The
Annealing.
craziest thing I saw was not Michael Crichton. It was like some 8-year-old kid. He's got like a 3-inch aluminum bar. And it's like, that's not a spoon. There's no way you can bend that. I'm looking at him. He does the thing he does. So you get into the, like bending a piece of taffy. My mouth dropped open. It's like, I'd have to take that and around a pole and, use all my strength to get it like that. He's doing it like it was nothing.
So you
If you
saw that
told me it
firsthand
was like 5 feet in front of me.
from an 8-year-old kid.
He was like 8, 10 years old. You know,
Wow.
he was there with his parents. He was probably dragged along, didn't want to go there, but he was getting in the mood or the mode to do that sort of thing. So, as far as the remote viewing was concerned,
Huh.
most of it was misses. That is, we had a process in place where we'd have targets. The person going out the target wouldn't know what target it was until like 30 minutes before. You either walk there or hop in the car and go drive there. And the person who was doing the viewing of it did it before we even went out. So let's say you were the person trying to sense what was going on. You do it at noon, and it's all over by the time I go out at 1 o'clock to the place. And we had a box of envelopes with targets inside. We shuffled them. They give them to me and say, Todd, get in the car and go. We'd go over there. I'd make notes about what it was. We had a Polaroid camera. Yes, we had Polaroid cameras. We'd take a picture of it and then go back. And we had like a 30 yes, no kind of question thing. Is it bigger than bread box, inside, outside, structure, natural, etc.? And we'll take that and then compare it to what the person back in the lab wrote and get some sort of correlation between them. Most of the time we had misses. Some of the times we had a hit, it was extraordinary. The written narrative of both was way more detailed than what the 30 questions could have given us. It's like the person was there in the person's shoes and was looking out at it. Now, some of them were close but no, what I call close but no cigar. I go out one day to a location. It was like an apartment building. I make my notes and everything. I take the picture of the apartment building. And again, Polaroid camera. I had one shot left in the roll. I thought, one shot's not going to be worthwhile for the next one because we usually take 2 or 3 pictures. I'll just turn over here and take a picture of this random thing over here, just to waste that last shot. Get back to the office, spread out the pictures. It's like, this one, this is exactly what he was describing. It was the thing that I offhandedly shot right before I left for going back to the office. So yeah, this stuff, I'm not saying that it's real. I'm saying that the objective things we were doing, it was not due to chance, especially the random event generator. I mean, we got like one chance in 10,000 of this being due to chance, where the controlled experiments were virtually every time it was well within 2 standard deviations. So what's the process? I don't know. What's the observation? I do know. So when it came to UAP, I wasn't fazed by the kind of things I was hearing about it. It's like, look, I've seen weirder things up close and personal. So yeah, I'll investigate this. Who cares?
Okay, you're kind of blowing my mind here, Todd. So
Kind
I'm
of.
gonna have to go over this again. All right, so we go back. It's 1979. You're an intern. Is that what it was? You're just starting your doctorate?
No, I was an undergraduate.
Oh, you're
I was
undergraduate. Okay, and they just
I was
needed.
looking for a research project and maybe some extra money to put food on the table because look, I was 19 and hungry, literally.
Okay, unbelievable. Okay, and so you end up signing up for this project. It sounds interesting, and so you were actually running some of these experiments for sounds like Russell Targ, Hal Puthoff, Edgar
Well,
Mitchell.
they were advisors who came in and they usually talk behind closed. They didn't talk to me, some teenager or whatever. But it's like these are obviously serious scientists, and I'm not sure exactly what relationship they have to the funding source and what we're doing here. Why are they out here? Again, I was an undergraduate. I asked questions, usually to myself, and I observed.
Okay, and how many of these, I guess, experiments did you run? Do you remember?
Oh gosh, it's been 40 plus years, and although there are more than a few papers out, and in fact, if you go to Princeton's website, they actually have, I believe, a list of some of the papers that were done, mostly after I left, because I left in 81. Most of what they published was in the mid 1980s. But I was their first intern. I mean, they were still building the lab when I got there. So I sort of laid the groundwork for whoever took over for me to run the experiments and do the statistical analyses.
The reason mainstream science doesn't accept any of these results is they just say that the experiments were done incorrectly, that there was misanalysis or there was some corruption in the data. From your own personal experience, you don't think that's the case?
Well, let me put it this way. They had nothing to gain from cheating or lying or whatnot because these were the dean of the engineering school. Duh, he was like a plasma physicist, had years of research. He had a reputation to uphold, but he was at the stage of life where he didn't care if people thought ill of him. So he made sure that this was following the basic protocols he would have for any other experiment. And as far as explaining away what went on, sure, there were debunkers and whatnot, including James the Amazing Randi, who was like a musician who was like the Mick West of his day, trying to unseat all the legitimacy behind all this. And it's like, great, they have their complaints, they have their rationale. It didn't really sit well with me because it's like, well, they cheated. Well, geez, I would have been the one cheating, and no, I didn't cheat. We
Yeah.
ran test data to make sure that the statistics was right. We had the protocols we followed every time. I looked at this, the remote viewing and the REG, the remote event generator experiments, as there are skills that we have that we just don't know of. If we went back in time to ancient Egypt, there are a few scribes who knew how to read. Most people didn't. They knew how to pull rocks around, and that's what they did for a living. Now, they had the capability of reading and writing and doing arithmetic, but they were never taught. And you don't naturally sort of like pop into being having these capabilities unless you have some sort of instruction. And I think that this sort of thing is along those lines. For example, and again, this is one of the resistance things I see in aviation and in society at large is embracing the woo or the woo-woo factor or the twilight zone factor, whatever you want to call it. So long as you stick with facts and data and things objective, it's more acceptable. Once you go into the realm of the woo, people want to run the other way. For example, I hear tell, haven't done it myself, that these what they call close encounter 5 CE5 protocols, where people can go out there, get into a meditative state, and call up orbs and other UAPs. Okay, is it real? I've seen stuff on the internet. I've seen interviews with very credible people, including who's that gentleman, Jake Barber, who
Yep.
was a hardcore special forces guy, hardcore special forces contractor, who's saying that not only is he doing it, but his kids are doing it on a regular basis. And I'm thinking, again, this is reading, writing, and arithmetic. If such a seal exists, give everybody out there the basics of how to do it. Let them go out there and do it themselves and let them have their own experiences. And again, let's get back to reading. If I told you back in ancient Egypt, I have a technology I can even teach your kids that can allow your kids to experience lives they've never lived, to live in real and fantasy worlds, at least in their mind. And not only that, they would have the ability to create their own real and fantasy worlds and share it with people, not just today, but generations after they die. You'd be hung for heresy. Yet that's what reading and writing is all about.
Now we have YouTube, and you can basically do that, essentially.
And having been on YouTube since YouTube was invented and having had podcasts for 20 years, I'm sure you can find stuff I've put out where you say to yourself, that's incredible, that's impossible, or he's crazy. Yeah, I'm a facts and data kind of guy. I put out facts and data. You
So
can
what
take it
is
or leave it. Like it is what it is.
so you mentioned Jake Barber, and yeah, he's been very controversial. I've seen a lot of pushback from the UFO community, which I'm really surprised by. You mentioned this 8-year-old encounter, or 8 to 10-year-old, bending the steel pipe, and you said
Aluminum,
he
three
prepared
inch
himself.
aluminum. Well, there was like okay, everybody, let's get our energy together type of thing. And sort of like the quintessential Southern California, you know, meditation group meeting kind of feeling is what I got. Again, I grew up in Texas. It's like that sort of California lifestyle was not me. So I'm like an
Yeah,
observer more than a participant most of the time. It's like, okay, this is how they do it here. Let me just roll with it.
yeah. I think the Texas saying is you get your ass kicked for doing something like that.
Usually the ass kicking
Texas,
comes before anybody tells you you're about to get your ass kicked.
amazing. So I guess do you think it's changing? What is your impression or viewpoint after being involved in that in 1979, and then going into the data world, not that remote viewing kind of world, aviation safety related world, and now coming back. It seems like your most popular podcast was on UAPs. It seems like that should be some incentive to look into more UAPs. What-
And I get like no love for my hardcore videos on aviation safety analysis. But look at what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
We are what, 8, 9,000, 6, 7,000 miles away from each other, having a live television conversation. We have on our desktops and even in our mobile devices the kind of globe spanning media potential that was only in the hands of the largest corporations and governments 30 years ago.
Mm.
That's one of the things that's changed. Whatever it is that you're into or want to talk about, no matter how far-fetched or far out it is, you can find an audience. Now, for most part, people find audiences for things that are silly and not really impactful. But here's something where, when it comes to global, globe-spanning things like aviation safety, it's been globe-spanning for a long time. Until recently, if you were not at the pinnacle, that is, if you're not at the government agency, if you're not in the organizations that make and fly the airplanes, if you're not a senior pilot who's well respected in the community, whatever you have to say is not going to get out there.
Yeah.
When I first put my website together, 1995, I started thinking about it. In 96, I put it out there. Sure, I was in aviation. Sure, I was on my way to getting a doctorate. I was doing all the things I thought you had to do to make waves in aviation. Got the education, had the operational experience, made presentations, etc. Yet breaking through to a larger audience was difficult. And I thought I'd have to work hard and become a senior official somewhere for that to happen. Then the internet came around. I launched my website 2 weeks before Flight 800. The day after Flight 800, I looked at my traffic. It went up by a factor of 20. And I thought, this internet might go someplace. And I also thought, let me not just do hardcore engineering. Let me also do what the people like. Or the phrase I would say to myself, give the people what they want, just a little bit of what I think they need.
Yeah, aviation safety was just like a bad word when I was in the Air Force. To get anyone to think about it, as soon as you said any relation to safety, which is too bad really, because it's total preservation of assets.
Now, this reminds me of something I realized when I was at Boeing. Uh, we developed, among other things, the 777 and other follow-ons to the 737. And basically, there's a lot of development activity going on from the engineering side. Safety would often come up as a potential issue. This system might lead to this risk or that risk. And literally, there could be hundreds of different issues that were vying for attention or funding or whatever. And having come out of business school before I went to Boeing, I thought, here's a marketing situation. We have a whole bunch of competitors with a similar product or service. How do you stand out above the others? It could be the quality of the presentation to management. It could be the quality of the analysis. By the way, presentations to management was way more effective than quality of the analysis. So the fight to make changes stick was often a sales and marketing approach. And as I would like to say, sales are rare. It's when somebody takes an action or has a change of mind about something. Marketing is everything else. Even if they do change their mind and say, this is a good idea, you have to follow that up to make sure that other people also get on board with that. And that once the train starts moving, the train keeps moving down the line. And I've used that approach when it came to putting my website together. It's like, look, I know what I think is important. It's not up to me to tell people, pay attention to this because it's important. It's my job to sort of entice people to come to their own conclusion and to use anything in my power to make that more likely. 2 examples. Everybody remembers Payne Stewart. Why do they remember Payne Stewart? He was a famous person. He died live on CNN. People were following it. And when I saw that this was happening, I thought, let me put together a single page that just talks about the Payne Stewart accident. Got plenty of traffic. In fact, like 15 years later, I look at my traffic, and it's like, why the heck did I get a big spike of traffic? It was the anniversary of his death. And he happened to be in an accident that involved hypoxia. So I thought, Payne Stewart and hypoxia, that will be forever linked, not forever, that will be linked in many people's minds for years to come. So whenever I had any discussion about hypoxia, I always referenced Payne Stewart.
Yeah, hypoxia is when you get too little oxygen to your brain actually, and you essentially get high and pass out. It's been involved in many crashes. I was hypoxic in Alaska actually. All these events in Alaska, and ended up being fine. Descended, no issues. But
I've
now
only had
what's
myopia and a chamber ride, and I liken it to behaving like you're drunk, but you're totally sober at the same time. So you don't think that you're drunk, but you definitely are.
Yeah, it's extremely dangerous. I've also gotten it on an airline flight. I don't think we need any more stories.
No more,
We're
no more
gonna
stories.
terrify the poor people already scared of flying.
Scary stories of the sky, we got enough of those.
Yeah, yeah. I got my hypoxia symptoms, which is general euphoria and then blue fingernails, etc. I told the flight attendant, and then all of a sudden the aircraft pressure systems changed. She went right up to the front, told the pilot, and then shortly after that, the cabin system was better pressurized. So I think it
Here's
was
where I
just
do
a
not
leaky
make a
jet.
side. Here's the point where I don't make a side trip talking about that door event with the 737 where it popped out in flight
Yep.
and they had a rapid decompression and the cockpit door flew open. I thought, why is that? Make a long story short, it's designed to do so in a rapid decompression for the 737 of that model. So why am I not going to digress on that? For a whole bunch of reasons. It's scary on several levels, including a security level. It's like
Huh.
some Hollywood producer can say, I know a way where the bad guys can open the cockpit door now.
Hmm. Excellent. All right. Before we scare too many more people, so after all your experience and all this, and you mentioned Jake Barber and the seems like we're getting a peek behind the curtain, and a lot of people I don't think are willing to accept it. But what is your general impression? You know, what do you think it means to be human? What do you think you've learned through your decades of experience?
Well, even from the aviation alone experience, there are parts of the human experience that are amazing once you sit back and look at it. For example, aviation as a whole, especially commercial aviation, is a global enterprise. You have cooperation amongst people who, in any other context, want to take the knives out and cut each other's throats, yet they'll cooperate on this. And your average aviation professional, they'll sit down and talk about this subject with somebody from North Korea, Iran. Doesn't really matter because the sky is like, this is the thing we're dealing with. And we are not bigger than the sky. That's one thing. Second, aviation takes every aspect of the human endeavor to understand the human part of it, the technological part of it, the sense of wonder, because there's always new surprises around the corner. And there has to be an enthusiasm about addressing those and resolving them, whether it be cockpit resource management, crew resource management, TCAS, or the UAP thing we're talking about now. And when we do discover those new things about ourselves, is it something that we're going to, reel back in terror from at first? Imagine the cultural change that had to happen where the captain was no longer, God Almighty, and that you actually had to have a way of looking at life where I don't care how junior the other people are in the cockpit, you have to put yourself in a state of mind where you're open to suggestion to keep yourselves from being killed.
Yeah.
So UAPs are just a variation of that. There's a marketing effort, there's a public education method aspect of it, there's a personal experience aspect of it. If you know someone who has experienced this, if you've experienced it yourself and seen the effects up close and personal, either the sense of wonder when it happens or nightmares afterwards, you'll have a whole different approach to addressing this going forward in your career.
Okay. Thank you so much, Todd, for your time. And I'd ask everyone in the audience to go check out Flight Safety Detectives. Link is in the description. And if you did like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this. Have a great rest of your day. Peace.